My name is Elena Voss, and I built my life in Seattle from nothing but discipline and silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace but from years of learning when not to speak, when not to need, when not to ask for more than what was quietly given, or more often, quietly withheld. The night my sister, Clara, told me not to come to her wedding, the city was wrapped in that familiar Pacific Northwest gray, the kind that pressed softly against the windows like an uninvited thought you couldn't quite shake. And I remember standing in my kitchen with a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, my laptop still open on the counter, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the spaces where conversation should have existed, where warmth should have lived, where something human should have reached me before everything shifted. She didn't call. There was no hesitation, no fragile attempt at softness, no pause where she might have reconsidered how the words would land on me. She sent an email. I heard the notification before I saw it, a quiet chime that felt so ordinary in the moment that I didn't think twice, didn't brace myself, didn't prepare for the way a single sentence could unravel something I had spent years carefully stitching together, piece by piece, excuse by excuse, compromise by compromise. When I opened it, there was no greeting. No "Hey, Elle." No "I'm sorry." Just a sentence, clean and efficient, like it had been written without ever once considering the person reading it. Due to limited seating, it's best if you watch via Livestream. Link attached. That was it. No signature that felt personal. No attempt at humor. No trace of hesitation. Just a link sitting beneath it, quiet and final, as if I were some distant acquaintance who needed logistical instructions, not the woman who had spent the last 6 months quietly building that wedding from the ground up, not the sister who had said yes to every request before it was even fully asked. I didn't move right away. I just stood there, one hand resting against the counter, the other hovering over the trackpad, rereading the sentence again and again as if repetition might reveal something hidden beneath it, some softer meaning, some context that would make it hurt less. But there was nothing else there, no second layer, no hidden apology, just the same cold clarity each time my eyes passed over the words. The blue glow of the screen reflected faintly in the window across from me, and for a moment, I caught sight of myself in it. Not clearly, not fully, just an outline, a suggestion of a person standing still in a room that suddenly felt unfamiliar, and I realized with a quiet, unsettling certainty that I didn't recognize the version of me staring back. Because that version of me had believed something that wasn't true. She had believed that being useful was enough. That if you gave enough, showed up enough, sacrificed enough, eventually it would translate into something warmer, something that resembled love. That version of me had just wired $70,000 that morning. I could still see the confirmation tab open in the background, the number sitting there in neat, unfeeling precision. A transaction completed in less than 5 seconds but built on years of effort, years of long nights and careful decisions and saying no to things I wanted so I could afford to say yes to things they needed. 70,000. On top of everything else. The venue Clara insisted had to feel elevated but intimate. The catering she changed twice because the plating didn't photograph well. The designer dress she said made her feel like herself for the first time. The handcrafted invitations she rejected 3 drafts of because the paperweight didn't feel right, even the small, ridiculous details like the custom napkins and the engraved place cards that no one would remember after the night was over. I had paid for all of it. Not because anyone forced me, but because it was expected. Because somewhere along the way, I had learned that my role in this family wasn't to be seen or celebrated, it was to make things easier, smoother, possible. And yet, in the story of her life, in the moment that was supposed to matter, I wasn't even a character. I wasn't a presence. I wasn't even an afterthought. I was a function, a resource, a line item that had already been processed and cleared. I was funding the stage, but banned from the audience. The realization didn't come all at once. It settled slowly, like a weight pressing down through layers of denial I hadn't realized I was still holding on to, and as it sank deeper, something inside me went quiet in a way that felt different from anything I had known before. The silence in my apartment felt heavier than grief. Grief, at least, has movement to it. It rises, it breaks, it asks to be felt. This wasn't that. This was stillness. A kind of internal pause where everything that used to make sense no longer held together. I closed the laptop gently, not out of calm but because any sudden movement felt like it might crack something open that I wasn't ready to face, and I leaned back against the counter, my eyes drifting toward the window again, toward that faint reflection of myself that now felt like a stranger I had been living as for far too long. I thought about all the moments that had led here, all the small, dismissible things I had chosen to reinterpret, to soften, to excuse. The times Clara told me to stay in my lane when I offered help. The way my mother always framed me as the strong one, as if strength meant I didn't require care. The quiet expectation that I would handle things without needing acknowledgement. I had spent years being needed, and for a long time, that had felt like enough. Because being needed meant I had a place. Being needed meant I couldn't be ignored entirely. Being needed felt dangerously close to being loved. But that night, standing alone in a kitchen filled with a faint smell of burnt coffee and the echo of a notification that had already done its damage, I understood something far more cruel, something that didn't ask for permission before settling into the center of my chest. Need is not love. Need is convenience. And I had been convenient for so long that I had mistaken it for belonging. I exhaled slowly, the breath leaving me in a way that felt heavier than it should have, as if I were releasing something I hadn't realized I was carrying. And for the first time, I didn't reach for my phone, didn't type a careful, measured response, didn't try to make it easier for her, for them, for anyone. I just stood there, still, present. And finally, undeniably aware of the truth I could no longer soften. I wasn't loved. I was convenient. It didn't start with a wedding, not with an email, not even with a quiet, clinical way my existence had been reduced to a link and a polite dismissal. It started years ago, in moments so small and ordinary that they never felt like wounds at the time, just slight discomforts I learned to smooth over, reinterpret, and eventually absorb until they became part of the structure of who I was. I didn't notice it happening. No one ever does. It wasn't a single moment of rejection that reshaped me, but 1,000 nearly invisible ones, each too minor to confront, too ambiguous to name, yet persistent enough to teach me, slowly and thoroughly, that love in my family came with conditions I was expected to understand without being told. When I got promoted, I remember the night clearly, not because anyone celebrated me, but because of how quickly the moment dissolved into something else. We were sitting at Clara's apartment, a place she had decorated with the kind of careful aesthetic that looked effortless but wasn't, candles lit in corners, music low enough to suggest intimacy without ever quite achieving it, and I had brought a bottle of wine I couldn't really afford at the time because I wanted, perhaps foolishly, to mark the occasion in a way that felt significant. I made partner track, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to sound like I needed too much from the moment. There was a brief pause, a flicker of acknowledgement. And then Clara smiled, tilted her head slightly, and said, "That's amazing, Elle," before turning to my mother and asking if she thought the curtains needed to be replaced because the lighting in the room felt off. And just like that, the moment passed. No questions. No curiosity. No sense that something meaningful had just happened in my life. I told myself it didn't matter, that they didn't fully understand what it meant. That success in my world was abstract to them, something distant and difficult to connect to emotionally. So I nodded, smiled, and let the conversation move on, quietly folding that small disappointment into a familiar place inside me where things like that went to disappear. When I bought my first home, I made the same mistake again. I thought it might be different. I invited them over for dinner, spent the entire afternoon preparing everything myself, down to arranging the table in a way that felt warm but not overly deliberate, because I didn't want it to seem like I was trying too hard, even though I was. I remember standing by the window as they walked in, watching their reflections move through the glass before they reached me, feeling that brief, almost childlike anticipation that maybe this time, they would see me clearly. "It's nice," my mother said, glancing around the living room with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Then, almost immediately, she turned to Clara. "Have you thought more about your rent situation?" she asked, her tone shifting into something softer, more concerned, more invested. Clara sighed, launching into a familiar explanation about expenses and timing and how things were just a little tight right now. And I stood there, still holding the serving spoon in my hand, listening as the focus shifted entirely, effortlessly, away from me. No one asked how I managed it. No one asked what it took. The house, like so many things in my life, simply became part of the background. Useful, convenient, but not worthy of attention. And again, I translated it. They're just worried about her. You're fine. You don't need that kind of validation. I became very good at that translation. It was a language I spoke fluently, turning absence into neutrality, turning disregard into misunderstanding, turning quiet dismissals into something that felt easier to carry. Because the alternative required admitting something I wasn't ready to face. That maybe they saw me exactly as they treated me. The pattern continued in ways that felt almost invisible from the outside but unmistakable from within. Late-night calls when something went wrong. Requests framed as assumptions. Can you just handle this? You're better at this than we are. It'll only take you a minute. And I said yes. Always yes. I stayed up nights fixing problems that weren't mine, drafting emails, making calls, transferring money, smoothing over situations that would have collapsed without intervention. And each time I did, I felt that familiar, fleeting sense of purpose, the illusion that I was essential, that I mattered because I could hold things together when no one else could. But when everything was stable again, when the crisis had passed, when the tension dissolved, so did I. No one lingered in gratitude. No one circled back to ask how I was. They just moved forward, as if the stability had always been there, as if I had simply maintained something that was naturally intact. They called me reliable. They called me strong. They called me the one we can always count on. But they never called me important. And somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting them to. I became the one who absorbed everything. The quiet fixer. The emotional shock absorber. The person who stood between chaos and collapse, not because I was asked to, but because I didn't know how not to. I told myself stories to make it bearable. They don't mean it. They just don't know how to show love. They appreciate you in their own way. You're different from Clara. You don't need the same things. And for a long time, those explanations were enough. They softened the edges. They gave me a way to stay without feeling completely invisible. But the truth is, love that has to be explained, justified, and constantly reinterpreted, is often just neglect wearing polite language. There was one memory, though, that never quite settled, no matter how many times I tried to reshape it into something less sharp. It came back to me in quiet moments, uninvited and unchanged. My mother had called me late one night, her voice softer than usual, almost reflective, as if she were allowing herself a rare moment of honesty. "You'll be fine, Elena," she said, after I told her I was overwhelmed, after I admitted, for once, that I didn't feel as steady as everyone believed me to be. "You always are." There was a pause, just long enough for me to think she might ask more, might lean into that vulnerability I had offered so carefully. But then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Clara is the one we worry about." The words didn't feel cruel when she said them. They weren't delivered with intention or malice. If anything, they were matter of fact, a simple statement of how things were, how they had always been. But something about them stayed with me. Because in that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. I wasn't the one they protected. I wasn't the one they nurtured. I was the one they relied on to not need protection, to not require nurturing, to not fall apart. That sentence built a cage around me, one that didn't look like a cage from the outside, because it was made of expectations that sounded like compliments, responsibilities that looked like strengths, roles that felt earned. But inside it, there was no room to be anything other than what they needed me to be. I wasn't allowed to fall apart. Because if I did, there would be no one left to hold everything together. And so I learned not to. I learned to swallow disappointment before it formed into something visible. To smooth over hurt before it could be questioned. To translate every moment of absence into something that felt easier to carry. Until one day, without realizing it, I stopped asking a question that should have mattered all along. Who holds me together? Because the answer, whether I admitted it or not, had always been the same. No one. Stillness is a dangerous kind of clarity, because once it settles in, It strips away every comforting lie you've ever told yourself and replaces it with something far colder, far sharper, and infinitely harder to ignore. I sat there, hands folded neatly on my lap, posture perfect out of habit rather than intention, while the noise of the room carried on as if nothing had shifted, laughter rising and falling, glasses clinking, chairs scraping softly against polished floors. Yet for me, everything had already changed in a way that could not be undone. It wasn't just what they said. It was how easily they said it. No hesitation. No guilt. No awareness that the person they were talking about was seated just feet away, breathing the same air, existing in the same space but somehow never truly seen. As long as Elena keeps paying, everything's fine. The sentence replayed in my mind, not louder, but clearer each time, like a truth sharpening itself with repetition until it cut clean through every justification I had ever made for them. I had spent years translating their indifference into something softer, something more forgivable, turning neglect into misunderstanding, selfishness into stress, dismissal into distraction, because believing they loved me, even imperfectly, felt safer than accepting that they simply didn't. But now, there was nothing left to translate. There was only truth. And truth, when it finally arrives, does not ask for permission. It settles in your chest, heavy and immovable, and forces you to sit with everything you once refused to see. I lifted my gaze across the room again, but this time I wasn't looking at Clara the way I used to, with quiet pride, with protective instinct, with the automatic urge to make sure she was okay. This time, I looked at her as she was. Radiant. Yes. Happy. Undeniably. But also completely untouched by me. Not once did her eyes search the room for mine. Not once did she gesture for me to come closer, to join her, to be part of the moment that I had helped build piece by piece with my time, my energy, my money. I realized then that I had mistaken proximity for connection. I had been present in her life, constantly, consistently, reliably, but presence means nothing when it is not valued. I was not part of her world. I was infrastructure. Useful. Necessary. Replaceable. The realization didn't come with tears. It came with something far more unsettling. A quiet detachment, as if I were stepping outside of my own life and seeing it from a distance for the very first time. And from that distance, everything looked painfully obvious. The promotion I celebrated alone. The house I bought without a single genuine congratulations. The countless nights spent answering calls, solving crises, transferring money, offering reassurance that was never returned. It formed a pattern I could no longer unsee. I wasn't overlooked by accident. I was positioned that way, carefully, consistently, because I allowed it. Because every time I minimized my own needs, every time I told myself, it's okay, every time I chose understanding over self-respect, I reinforced the role they had assigned me. The dependable one. The strong one. The one who doesn't need anything. And people will believe whatever version of you requires the least effort from them. A server passed by, placing a fresh glass of water in front of me without making eye contact, and for a brief moment, I wondered if he saw me more clearly than my own family did. Just another quiet figure occupying space without demand, without disruption. I reached for the glass, my fingers steady, and took a slow sip, grounding myself in something physical, something real, because everything else felt like it had just shifted beneath me. Behind me, the conversation had moved on. Different topic. Different laughter. As if the sentence that had just rewritten my entire understanding of my place in their lives had been nothing more than a passing remark. But that's the thing about truth. It doesn't need to be dramatic to be devastating. Sometimes it arrives in a whisper. I set the glass down and let my gaze drift toward the exit, the service door just a few steps away, swinging open and closed with quiet regularity as staff moved in and out, unseen yet essential, much like I had been in this family for as long as I could remember. For a fleeting second, I considered leaving. Just standing up, walking out, and letting the absence speak for itself. But I didn't. Not yet. Because leaving without understanding why I had stayed for so long would only repeat the same pattern somewhere else, with different people, under different circumstances. And for the first time, I didn't just want distance. I wanted clarity. I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing myself to observe instead of participate, to take in the dynamics without filtering them through loyalty or obligation. My mother was at the far end of the table, leaning toward Clara, her expression soft, attentive in a way I recognized immediately, because it was never directed at me. Concern, care, investment, all reserved for the one who needed it more. "You'll be fine, Elena. You always are." The words echoed again, but now I heard them differently. Not as reassurance, not as confidence in my strength, but as permission to ignore me. Because if I was always fine, then I never required attention. If I never required attention, then I could be deprioritized without guilt. And if I could be deprioritized without guilt, then I would always come last. It was a system that worked perfectly, for everyone except me. Clara reached for my mother's hand, squeezing it gently as they spoke, and the intimacy of that small gesture struck me harder than anything else that evening. Not because I envied it, but because I finally understood it had never been mine to begin with. I had been trying to earn something that was never offered. And you cannot earn what someone has already decided not to give. The weight of that realization settled deeper, but instead of crushing me, it clarified something else, something I had never allowed myself to consider fully. If I was not valued here, then why was I still trying to belong? The question lingered, quiet but persistent, threading its way through every memory, every sacrifice, every moment I had chosen them over myself. 4 years, the answer had been simple. Because they're family. Because that's what you do. Because love means staying. But sitting there, near the service door, with a faint smell of disinfectant marking the edges of my existence in that room, I began to understand that staying had never actually brought me closer to them. It had only taken me further away from myself. And that, more than anything, was the part one could no longer ignore. Across the room, Clara raised her glass for a toast, her voice bright, confident, filled with gratitude, for the guests, for the moment, for the life she was stepping into. But not once did she mention me. Not once did my name pass her lips. And this time, I didn't feel hurt. I felt certain. Certain that the version of me who had accepted this, who had called this love, who had called this enough, no longer existed. I sat there until the applause faded, until the laughter resumed, until the rhythm of the evening returned to something familiar and unchanged for everyone else. But inside me, something fundamental had shifted. Not broken, not shattered, just realigned. And as I finally rose from my seat, smoothing my dress with quiet precision, I understood something with a clarity I had never known before. The moment you see your place in someone's life clearly, is the moment you have to decide whether you're willing to stay there. And for the first time, I wasn't sure that I was. The silence in my apartment felt different that night. Not heavy, not suffocating, but precise, like the air itself had been cleared of something invisible that I had been breathing in for years without realizing it was slowly eroding me from the inside. I placed my keys on the counter with deliberate care, the soft metallic sound echoing faintly through the stillness, and for a moment, I simply stood there, letting the absence of noise settle into me, letting the distance between that dinner and this space stretch wide enough for me to finally hear my own thoughts without interruption. No phone calls. No messages. No expectations pressing in from every direction. Just me. And the truth I could no longer unsee. I walked toward my desk, each step unhurried, not because I was uncertain, but because I wasn't. That was the unsettling part. There was no storm inside me, no emotional chaos demanding immediate release, no anger clawing at my chest, no grief spilling over into tears. Just clarity. Cold. Steady. Uncompromising. I opened my laptop, the familiar glow illuminating my face in the darkened room, and for a brief second, I caught my reflection in the black edge of the screen. Calm, composed, almost detached in a way that would have frightened me before, but now felt like control. Real control. Not the kind that comes from managing everything for everyone else, but the kind that comes from finally choosing yourself. My inbox loaded slowly, threads of conversations unfolding one after another, each subject line a quiet testament to how deeply embedded I was in every part of Clara's wedding. Vendor confirmations, payment schedules, design revisions, last-minute adjustments I had handled without hesitation, without question, without ever asking why it was always me who had to make things work. I clicked into the first email. The venue. A beautiful space, expensive in a way that Clara had insisted was non-negotiable, because this day had to be perfect, because imperfections were unacceptable, because appearances mattered more than anything else, including me. My name sat neatly at the bottom of the contract. Primary contact, financial guarantor, responsible party. I stared at those words for a moment, not with resentment, but with recognition. This was never shared responsibility. It was transferred responsibility, given to me under the quiet assumption that I would accept it, because I always had, because I always did. I scrolled down to the payment section, my eyes moving over the numbers that once would have made me pause, calculate, consider. Now, they felt distant, irrelevant. Not because they didn't matter, but because I had finally understood that what I was paying for was never just a wedding. I was paying for access, for approval, for a place in a story that had already decided I didn't belong. And suddenly, it no longer felt worth the cost. My cursor hovered over the contact email for the venue coordinator, blinking steadily as if waiting for permission I no longer needed to give. I began to type. Not an explanation. Not an apology. Just a statement. A clean break. Please consider this formal notice to cancel all remaining arrangements under my name, effective immediately. I paused only once, not out of doubt, but out of awareness. Because I knew, with absolute certainty, that there would be consequences. Calls. Messages. Confusion turning into anger. Accusations layered with disbelief. How could you do this? Why would you do this? After everything? But the truth was simple. I wasn't doing this to them. I was doing this for me. I hit send. The sound was almost inaudible, a soft click that carried none of the weight of what it represented. And yet, something inside me shifted instantly, like a door closing quietly but firmly, sealing off a part of my life I would never return to in the same way again. I moved to the next email. Catering. Another contract. Another confirmation. Another place where my name existed not as a guest, not as family, but as a resource. Cancelable. Replaceable. Expected. I repeated the process. Brief. Direct. Final. No emotion bleeding into the words. No justification offered. Because boundaries do not require negotiation when they are built on truth. With each message sent, the pattern unraveled further, threads I had woven so carefully now being pulled apart by my own hands. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but with intention. Floral installations. Cancelled. Designer coordination. Cancelled. Custom invitations still awaiting final approval. Cancelled. Every detail that had once felt like a contribution to something meaningful now revealed itself for what it had always been. A transaction disguised as love. And I was done paying. Minutes passed. Or maybe it was longer. Time felt irrelevant in that moment, measured not in seconds but in decisions, in the quiet accumulation of actions that, taken individually, seem small, but together form something irreversible. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, my body registering the shift before my mind fully caught up. There was no immediate relief. No surge of triumph. Just space. A widening sense of distance between who I had been and who I was becoming. For so long, my identity had been built around being needed, around anticipating problems before they surfaced, around stepping in before anyone even had to ask. And now, for the first time, I had chosen not to. Not out of spite. Not out of anger. But out of understanding. Because I finally saw that being needed is not the same as being valued. And once you see that difference, you cannot unsee it. My phone remained still beside me. No notifications. No interruptions. The quiet stretched on, uninterrupted, as if the world had yet to catch up to what I had just set in motion. But it would. I knew it would. And when it did, it wouldn't be quiet. There would be questions, demands, perhaps even attempts to pull me back into the role I had just stepped out of. Because people rarely accept the loss of something that has always benefited them, especially when they never had to earn it in the first place. I closed my laptop slowly, the screen fading to black, my reflection appearing once more, only this time I recognized the person looking back at me. Not because she was stronger, not because she was unbreakable, but because she was finally honest. Honest about what she had tolerated, honest about what she deserved, honest about what she would no longer accept. I stood up and walked toward the window, the city lights of Seattle stretching out in the distance, steady and indifferent, as they always had been. Nothing out there had changed. The world continued, unaware. But inside me, something fundamental had shifted into place. A boundary, invisible to everyone else, but immovable. And in that quiet, I understood something with a certainty that didn't need to be spoken aloud. You don't need to raise your voice to reclaim your life. You don't need confrontation to create distance. You don't need permission to stop giving what was never truly appreciated. Sometimes, the most powerful decision you will ever make is the one no one hears. Because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply changes everything. And as I stood there, watching the lights flicker in the distance, I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting to be needed. I was finally free to choose. And I had already made the quietest decision of all. I wasn't going back. The morning arrived without ceremony, pale light slipping through my curtains as if the day itself didn't quite understand what it was walking into, as if it still believed it was meant to carry joy, celebration, something soft and golden, when in reality, it was about to unravel under the weight of something far more fragile than any of them had ever prepared for. I was already awake, not restless, not anxious, just awake in a way I hadn't been before, my mind clear, my body still, as though I had stepped outside the urgency that used to define me and into something quieter, something grounded. Then my phone lit up. Once. Twice. And then it didn't stop. The screen flickered relentlessly against my nightstand, vibrations stacking over vibrations, a constant, insistent demand for my attention that would have once sent a surge of adrenaline through me, would have pulled me upright, heart racing, mind already scrambling to assess damage, to solve, to fix. But not today. I let it ring. I let it buzz. I let it fill the room with urgency that no longer belonged to me. When I finally reached for it, it wasn't out of panic, it was out of choice. Missed calls. Dozens. Messages layered over each other so quickly they blurred into a single stream of accusation, confusion, and rising panic. What did you do? They're saying the venue is cancelled. Elena, answer your phone right now. This isn't funny. You need to fix this immediately. The words carried no curiosity, no concern, only expectation. The same expectation that had followed me for years, the quiet, unwavering assumption that whatever went wrong, I would be the one to make it right. Because I always had. Because I always did. Until now. I scrolled slowly, not reacting, not absorbing the emotional weight they were trying to place back onto me, because I could finally see it for what it was. Not love, not connection, but dependence without accountability. And then I saw her name. Clara. Her message sat there, sandwiched between the chaos of everyone else's reactions, but somehow more revealing than all of them combined. Please fix this. I stared at it for a long moment, my thumb hovering just above the screen, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. Completely. There was no confusion in her words. No attempt to understand why this had happened. No acknowledgement of anything beyond the immediate inconvenience to her. Not, what's going on? Not, did I do something? Not, are you okay? Just, fix it. The simplicity of it was almost impressive in its honesty. Because in that one sentence, stripped of pretense, stripped of politeness, stripped of any illusion of emotional awareness. She told me exactly what I had always been to her. Not a sister. Not someone she loved. But a solution. And solutions, by definition, are not meant to have needs of their own. I exhaled slowly, the breath leaving my body without tension, without hesitation, because there was nothing left to process. Nothing left to question. This was the confirmation, not the cause. The cause had been years in the making. This was just the moment it revealed itself completely. My phone rang again. Her name this time. Clara. The screen pulsed with it, over and over, as if persistence could replace accountability, as if repetition could undo a decision that had already been made long before this morning arrived. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, and then, finally, I answered. Hello. My voice was calm, even, almost unfamiliar in its steadiness, as though it belonged to a version of me who no longer rushed to meet urgency with urgency. Elena, what is going on? Her voice came through sharp, strained, the edges fraying under pressure. They're telling me everything's been cancelled. The venue, the catering, the flowers. What did you do? There was no pause between her questions. No space for reflection. Only escalation. I listened. Fully. Without interrupting. Without preparing a defense. Because for the first time, I didn't feel the need to justify myself. When she finally stopped speaking, if only to catch her breath, I answered. I didn't cancel your wedding. A beat of silence followed, thin and fragile. Then I continued, my tone unchanged. I canceled my role in it. The silence that came after was different. Not the brief pause of someone waiting for clarification, but the kind of silence that forms when something fundamental no longer makes sense within the framework someone has always relied on. What does that even mean? She snapped, the confusion quickly hardening into irritation. You paid for everything. You handled everything. You can't just step out. That's not how this works. I almost smiled. Not out of amusement, but out of recognition. Because she was right. That wasn't how it had worked before. But that system only existed because I upheld it. And the moment I stopped, it collapsed. Quietly. Completely. That's exactly how it works, I said, still calm, still steady, my words landing without force but with finality. You're being ridiculous, she shot back, her voice rising now, the strain no longer contained. Do you have any idea what you've done? People are already arriving. This is my wedding day, Elena. My wedding day. And there it was. Not our family. Not our relationship. Not anything that existed between us beyond this event. Just her day. Her experience. Her expectation. I know exactly what today is, I replied. And I know exactly what I've done. You need to call them back, she insisted, the desperation beginning to surface beneath the anger. You need to fix this. Right now. The words echoed her message. Fix it. Always fix it. Because that was the role. That was the contract. Unspoken. Unquestioned. Until I questioned it. No, I said. The word was quiet. Simple. But it landed heavier than anything else I could have said. Another silence followed. But this one wasn't fragile. It was breaking. You can't just say no, she said, her voice lower now, more controlled, but edged with something sharper. You don't get to walk away like this. And for the first time in the conversation, something shifted, not in me, but in her. Because control, once absolute, was now slipping. And people rarely respond gently to losing control they never thought they could lose. I already did, I answered. Her breath hitched slightly, a subtle crack in the composure she was trying to hold together. This is unbelievable, she said. After everything we've been through, after everything I trusted you with, you're just going to sabotage my wedding? Sabotage. The word hung there, heavy with accusation, but also with deflection. Because calling it sabotage meant she didn't have to call it consequence. I didn't sabotage anything, I said. I just stopped participating. The distinction mattered, even if she refused to see it. You're selfish, she snapped, the word thrown like a final attempt to regain ground. You're thinking about yourself for once and suddenly nothing else matters? For once. I let that settle, not as an insult, but as confirmation. Yes, I said softly. For once. The line went quiet. No immediate response. No quick rebuttal. Just silence stretching out between us, filled with everything she didn't know how to say, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging me in a way she never had before. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed. Less sharp. More uncertain. What am I supposed to do now? It was the first honest question she had asked. Not because it centered me, but because it revealed something real. She didn't know how to function without me in that role. And that was never my responsibility to fix. That's something you'll have to figure out, I said gently. Not cold. Not cruel. Just true. You're unbelievable, she whispered. But this time, it didn't sound like anger. It sounded like disorientation. Like the ground beneath her had shifted and she didn't know how to stand on it anymore. Maybe, for the first time, she was experiencing what I had felt for years. The call ended shortly after. No resolution. No understanding. Just distance. And as I lowered the phone, the silence in my apartment returned. Not empty, not heavy, but steady. Unshaken. Because outside, somewhere across the city, a wedding was unraveling in ways they never expected. Plans collapsing, expectations cracking, reality forcing its way into a space that had been built entirely on assumption. Assumption that I would always be there. Always give. Always fix. But inside me, there was no chaos. No regret. Only clarity. Because for the first time in my life, their world was falling apart. And mine was finally holding together. I left Seattle the next day without ceremony, without the kind of lingering hesitation that once would have kept me anchored in place long after I knew I needed to go, because this time there was no internal negotiation left to be had, no part of me still trying to justify staying for people who had never once questioned what it cost me to remain. The suitcase I packed was small. Intentionally so. Not because I didn't own more, but because I didn't want to carry anything that belonged to a version of me I had already outgrown. No excess, no emotional clutter disguised as necessity, no objects tied to obligations I had finally released. Just the essentials. Just enough. Just me. The airport felt like a threshold rather than a destination, a quiet in-between space where no one knew me, no one expected anything from me, no one looked at me and saw a role they had assigned. I moved through it calmly, almost invisibly, blending into the steady rhythm of strangers passing each other without history, without expectation, without the weight of shared narratives that needed constant maintenance. For the first time in years, I existed without context. And instead of feeling lost, I felt free. Vancouver wasn't a grand decision. It wasn't symbolic in the way people often expect life changes to be, wasn't chosen for meaning or memory or even opportunity. It was simply available. A city close enough to reach without overthinking, distant enough to create separation, neutral enough that I could arrive without carrying the imprint of who I had been. And that neutrality mattered more than anything. Because I wasn't trying to build a new life yet. I was trying to understand what it felt like to live one that didn't revolve around being needed. The apartment I found was small, quiet, and almost bare in a way that would have once made me uncomfortable, because I used to associate emptiness with lack, with something missing that needed to be filled. But now, as I stood in the middle of that space, sunlight filtering softly through wide windows, casting long, gentle shadows across untouched floors, I understood something differently. This wasn't emptiness. This was space. Space that didn't demand anything from me. Space that didn't expect me to anticipate problems, to fill silences, to manage emotions that weren't mine. Space that simply existed and allowed me to do the same. The first few days passed quietly, not in the restless way silence used to follow me, but in a steadier rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar at first, as though my body kept waiting for interruption, for urgency, for something to pull me back into the version of myself that reacted before thinking. But nothing came. No frantic calls. No escalating problems. No subtle expectations hidden inside casual conversations. Just time. Unstructured. Unclaimed. Mine. I woke when I wanted. Ate when I felt hungry. Walked through unfamiliar streets without purpose, without destination, letting the city unfold around me without needing to interpret it, without needing to make it meaningful. Because for once, I wasn't trying to prove anything. Not to them. Not even to myself. I wasn't trying to show that I was okay. I was simply allowing myself to be. And that, I realized, was something I had never truly done before. My phone remained quiet for the most part, though not entirely. Messages had come in during the first day, then the second, then less frequently after that. A mixture of anger, confusion, and carefully phrased concern that felt more like obligation than genuine care. I didn't respond, not because I was punishing them, but because I understood something I hadn't before. Not every version of the story needs your correction. People will shape events in ways that protect their perspective, their comfort, their sense of control. They will call you selfish when you stop sacrificing. They will call you distant when you stop overextending. They will rewrite your silence as guilt, your absence as betrayal, your boundaries as cruelty, because it allows them to avoid asking harder questions about their own behavior. And I let them, because defending myself would have meant stepping back into the same dynamic I had just left, explaining, justifying, translating my choices into something more acceptable, more digestible, more aligned with what they wanted me to be. But I wasn't that person anymore, and I didn't owe them a version of me that no longer existed. Days turned into a week, then another. The distance settled in, not as something sharp or painful, but as something quiet and expansive, like a horizon stretching further the longer I allowed myself to walk toward it. There were moments, of course. Small ones. Unexpected. A passing memory triggered by something ordinary. A song, a scent, a fleeting image of a family laughing together across a cafe. Moments where something inside me softened, where the absence of them made itself known in a way that wasn't about obligation or responsibility, but about something simpler. Familiarity. History. A version of belonging that, even if it was flawed, had once felt like enough. And in those moments, I didn't push the feeling away. I let it exist. Because missing someone doesn't mean you made the wrong decision. It just means you're human. Do I miss them? Sometimes. I miss the idea of what we could have been. I miss the version of connection I kept trying to build, even when it was clear I was building it alone. I miss the moments that felt almost real, almost balanced, almost like love. But I don't miss who I had to be to stay. I don't miss the constant calculation, the quiet exhaustion of always being the one who adjusted, the one who gave more, the one who held everything together while slowly coming apart in ways no one noticed, because I had made sure they never had to. And that difference matters. More than anything else. Because walking away wasn't about rejecting them. It was about refusing to reject myself any longer. One afternoon, I found myself sitting by the window, a cup of coffee warming my hands, the city moving quietly below, and for no particular reason, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What do I want? Not what do they need. Not what is expected. Not what would make things easier, smoother, more acceptable. Just, what do I want? The answer didn't come immediately. Not in words. Not in clear, structured thoughts. But in something softer. A feeling. A pull toward something that didn't require me to prove my worth in order to receive care. Something that didn't confuse being needed with being valued. Something that allowed me to exist without constantly earning my place. Peace. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of pressure. And for the first time, that felt possible. Not distant, not theoretical, but real. Because I had already done the hardest part. I had let go. And as I sat there, Watching the light shift slowly across the room, I understood something that would have once terrified me, but now felt like the beginning of everything. When you stop holding everything together, things will fall apart. Relationships, expectations, illusions you spent years maintaining. But what remains? What rebuilds itself in the space that's left behind? That's the part that belongs to you. And maybe that's the question no one ever asks out loud, the one hidden beneath all the fear of walking away. What happens when you finally let go? The answer isn't immediate. It isn't clean. It isn't easy. But somewhere in the quiet that follows, in the space where obligation used to live, in the stillness where you no longer disappear just to keep others comfortable, your life begins to take shape in a way it never could before. Not defined by who needs you, not measured by what you give, but grounded in something far more stable, something real, yourself. And for the first time in my life, that was enough.